but many have not come. Yeah. Should we wait?
We can start, sir.
Okay. Okay. So we are in the middle of something. So we started with the ring. Then we introduced polynomial ring. It's coming soon. Okay, polynomial ring. Then we introduced one kind of homomorphism called substitution principle. Okay, using that many properties we have been deducing. Okay, last class, then we looked at the ideals. Then R modulo I. What is that R modulo? The quotient ring. Then we extended the. I mean, suppose R is given, and we want to extend the ring R to some other ring. So we have introduced one kind of recipe for that. Okay, that recipe leads to, so when R has a kind of some elements are invertible in with respect to multiplication. Many elements may not be invertible. So if we can suppose if we are doing adjoining the inverse of that element, we get a new ring. That's then we kind of hopeful to get a kind of field, because by doing all the inverses, adjoining all the inverses of that ring R, we hope to get a kind of field. Okay, ring to field. But the point is there are some elements creating a problem. That elements are called zero divisors. That last class we have seen. Okay, zero divisors, when we attach, then the trouble comes. So generally, when we extend a ring to another ring, this the original ring should be inside, or at least isomorphic copy should be inside the bigger ring. Okay, but when we attach the inverse of that zero divisor, this is not the case. The original ring may not be inside the new ring. Okay, so therefore we had to kind of restrict our attention to those rings which do not have zero divisors. Okay, those domains are called integral domains. Okay, so this is what kind of. Okay, so last class we just introduced what is integral domain. Integral domain very naturally comes. So we started with a ring, commutative ring, and then we were trying to attach all the inverses of the multiplicative inverses to this ring. But the point is, some of the inverses which is not kind of producing what we wanted. Therefore, we had to restrict our attention, not all rings, but we restricted the attention to the integral domains. So integral domains means there is no zero divisor in the ring R. So that is called integral domain. Okay, so any field is an integral domain, and in the integral domain, naturally the cancellation law holds for the multiplicative also. And R is an integral domain, then R of X is also integral domain. These are all the last class we have seen. Okay, and an integral domain with finitely many elements is a field. I'm just recalling to you. Okay. Okay. So then any integral domain can be pushed inside a field. That is what finally we constructed. What is that field? We constructed the fraction field, or field of fractions. The model is from integer to rational number. How we kind of constructed rational numbers, same model from the integral domain to fraction field. Okay, so same model. What I didn't check is this the addition is kind of this addition and the multiplication. This really produces the field. Okay, F. That I didn't check. So if we take a K is a field and R is a polynomial ring over K, then K is an integral domain. Therefore R is also integral domain. Then the fraction field of the polynomial ring, over the field K is the set of rational functions, a field of rational functions, which is like a polynomial divided by polynomial, where G is not a zero polynomial. Okay, so when we divide, it should not be a zero polynomial. It can have roots somewhere, but the point is G is not a zero polynomial. Okay, this is what is a rational functions over K with variable X. Okay, the main theorem we want to see is that, okay, so we have, suppose R is an integral domain, and we have constructed the field of fractions F. Okay, suppose this R is some kind of sitting inside another field, then what happens to the field of fraction to that given field? That's what this theorem is. This is generally in the modern terms, it's a kind of universal property, they say. Whatever it can be, whatever it means, this is called universal property. Okay, so let R be an integral domain with the field of fraction F. Let K be any field, and suppose we have an injective ring homomorphism from R to K. Okay, then this induces a unique homomorphism. This given homomorphism induces a unique homomorphism from the field of fraction F to K, such that when we restrict this, because field of fraction F contains R, okay, therefore when we restrict this particular unique map to R, we get back our phi. Okay, and this map is also defined like this. So this, what does this mean? It means, in some sense, field of fraction, the field of fractions is the smallest field containing R. Okay, this is what it says in some sense. Okay, it's easy to check. First of all, okay, we want to construct the homomorphism from F to K. So we start with any element. Any element is a equivalence relation, equivalence class. Yeah, the representation is look like A by B. A by B belongs to F, where B is non-zero. Since little phi, the phi function phi from the ring homomorphism phi is an injective ring homomorphism from R to K. Since B is non-zero, therefore phi of B is also non-zero. The phi of B is non-zero element of K. Therefore, phi of B inverse exists in K. Therefore, phi of A times phi of B inverse belongs to K. Therefore, one can define capital phi of A by B as little phi of A divided by little b of B. Okay. So therefore, this makes sense. Whether it is well defined or not, we have to check. So well definedness means two elements, two different element can have one image, but one element cannot have two image. That's what one has to check. Well definedness means if suppose A1 by B1 is related to A2 by B2, then we want to really say that the images are same. Okay, one element I have taken means two representation I am taken. Okay, from the equivalence class A1 by B1 and A2 by B2. The image under by the definition, this will be like a phi of A1 times phi of B1 inverse. The other one image is going to be phi of A2 times phi of B2 whole inverse. Okay, these two we want to prove that it is one and the same. Since A1 by B1 is related to A2 by B2 by the equivalence relation, A1 B2 equal to A2 B1. So now we apply the ring homomorphism phi. These are all ring elements. Okay, so we apply the ring homomorphism phi, then we see that things are matching. Okay, so phi is indeed a homomorphism. Okay, this is you can just check it. It's a well-defined map, and it is indeed a homomorphism. It's a ring homomorphism from F to K, and the restriction is clearly phi only, because it is built from phi only, little phi. And we want to prove the uniqueness part. Okay, suppose is there if any other homomorphism, ring homomorphism from F to K such that its restriction map is the little phi, then we want to prove this psi map is same as the capital phi map. Okay. So how we prove? We just check psi of, since it is a homomorphism already given, therefore psi of 1 by 1, that is going to 1 only, that is same as phi of 1. Okay. So then psi restricted to phi, restricted to R is nothing but phi. Therefore, psi of A by 1. A by 1 is the thing element in F, but representing the element of the ring R. Therefore, psi of A by 1 is same as okay, psi of A by 1 is same as phi of A, but phi of little phi of 1 is 1. Therefore, I am just dividing it by phi of 1 kind of thing. Okay. So, therefore, we kind of managed to write psi restricted to R element like this. Now we want to do it for any, I mean, any element. Psi of A by B is equal to phi of capital phi of A by B. That's what we want to say. The both maps are equal. So for that, we just develop 1 equal to psi of 1 by 1. This is same as A by 1 times 1 by A. Why this is? Because these two are these two, the 1 by 1, this is same as this. Okay, that is just you check the cross multiplication, you see that it is true indeed. Okay, just multiplication map. Okay, so since psi is a homomorphism, then again we are separating it, and here A is non-zero we have taken. So therefore, from this equation, I mean 1 equal to psi of A by 1 times psi of 1 by A. From this equation, what we get is psi of 1 by A is same as phi of A inverse phi of 1. That is phi of A inverse only. Okay. So therefore, psi of A by B, the general element in the field F, is, we write it as psi of A by 1 dot 1 by B. Okay, then it is a ring homomorphism. Then you plug it, whatever we have computed, that is same as phi of A by B. Therefore, both maps are equal. So this really says that, okay, so this also says that, suppose if K is another field of fraction, K is another field of fraction for R, F is another field of fraction for R, two field of fractions are there, then it is isomorphic. Okay, by replacing the role of F and K, you can get isomorphism. That's what it says. It's up to isomorphism is unique. Okay, that's okay. So this is called field of fraction. So field of fraction, what it does, it is putting the ring, which is a special class of ring. It is called integral domain, putting inside into a field. Okay, it's a here putting inside a field means there is a injective homomorphism, ring homomorphism from the ring R, the integral domain R to a field F. Okay. Intuitively, this is some kind of subring. This, okay, inside a field. Okay. Now the next section, what it says, again we are trying to understand the ring homomorphism. Now we take ring homomorphism from the R to the field F. Okay, and we, what are all surjective homomorphisms available from R to the field F. F is given to you field and R is given to you. Okay, so we try to see what are all surjective homomorphisms from R to F. We want to investigate this. Okay, such a homomorphism, suppose if one homomorphism is given, then by first isomorphism theorem, what we know is, since it is surjective ring homomorphism, R modulo the kernel of phi is isomorphic to the field F. Okay, kernel phi, we already seen that it is an ideal. Okay, and R modulo ideal is isomorphic to the field F. Okay, this is, therefore you see, we get an isomorphism complete. So it means we can able to, if we can understand the kernel, various kernel, what are all kernels can come, we can understand this phi also. Okay, so what are all possible kind of ideals whose modulus, when we go modulo I, to the ring R, if we get back the field F, then we understand the homomorphism also. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, to classify such homomorphism, we must determine all the ideals M such that R mod M is a field. Okay, by the ideal correspondence theorem, okay, in the quotient ring, what are the ideals of R mod M in the ideal correspondence? Okay, this any ideal of R mod M corresponds to the ideal of R which contains M. Okay, which contains M. Also, the field is how we have characterized the field. Field is characterized by the property of exactly two ideals, having two ideals, F and zero ideal. Okay, itself. So since if R bar is a field, there are exactly two ideals containing M, which is namely M and R. This is through ideal correspondence theorem. Okay, so R bar is the quotient ring is a field, therefore it contains only two ideals, namely zero ideal and the whole ideal. If it is a zero ideal, okay, if it is zero ideal means that M has to be whole of R. Okay, so whole of R. If R bar is okay, R bar is a field first of all. Okay, it cannot be zero. Okay, R bar is a field. Since R bar is a field, what are the ideal possible ideals? Okay, in the correspondence, R bar is nothing but R modulo M. Okay, R bar is a field, therefore we have only two ideals, namely R bar and the zero element. Zero element is nothing but M. Okay, zero element is nothing but M here in the quotient ring. So the whole or the quotient, therefore that corresponds to M and R only. Okay, here only two, there only two, because it is correspondence, bijective correspondence we have. Okay, all the ideals containing M is bijective correspondence with all the ideals contain all the ideals of the quotient ring. Okay, so therefore we have only two ideals, M and R, in the ring R having this property. Okay, such ideal we call maximal. Okay, we define it. So this is kind of patching it up, how we are coming. An ideal M is maximal if, first of all, it should not be the whole ring, but it is not contained in any other ring also, except M and R. Okay, other than. So there is no in-between ideal. If M is maximal means in between M and R, there is no other ideal. Just this is the maximal one. Okay, by this, whatever the previous discussion, I'm just writing it as a corollary. An ideal M of a ring R is maximal if and only if R mod M is a field. This is what getting from the previous, page, the discussion. Of course, you can, many other books, they will, different way they prove. Here, they have proved using the ideal correspondence theorem, okay? The quotient ring and the ring R. Okay. So, suppose zero ideal is maximal, then what happens? If zero ideal is maximal, when we quotient that zero ideal, what happens? R modulo zero ideal is what? It is just R itself, isomorphic to R itself, and it should be a field by the previous one. Therefore, the zero ideal is maximal if and only if R is a field. Okay, in this way of definition. Okay. So the next proposition just clears out all the maximal ideals in the ring of integers Z. Okay. The every maximal ideal, first of all, every ideal is principal here in the ring of integers. Already we have seen. Okay. So therefore, it is of the type n times Z, where n is a natural number. Okay. Nz is a maximal if and only if Z mod Nz is a field. It means if and only if the ideals containing Nz are Nz and Z. Okay. If n is not prime, it is a composite number, then you can find more ideals. Okay, one more ideal which contains nz. Okay, by looking at therefore it is if and only if n must be a prime, since only ideals containing nz is r nz and the whole ring r, whole ring z. Okay, this is just easy to check. Now again we are entering to the polynomial ring where the coefficients are coming from complex numbers c of x. We want to describe all the maximal ideals of the polynomial ring in one variable first over complex numbers. Okay, cx. Okay, this is the proposition. Okay, the maximal ideals of the polynomial ring, this proposition says maximal ideals in the polynomial ring cx are the principal ideals that we know already, because the c is a field and therefore c of x is a principal ideal. Every ideal is a principal ideal generated by one element. Okay, but that element here it's very prescribed. The every ideal, the maximal ideal of the polynomial ring, okay, is generated by a linear polynomial x minus a for some complex number a. Okay, so first of all, we know in cx it's every ideal is principal. It means every ideal is generated by single polynomial. But if it is a maximal ideal, this proposition says it is generated by a linear polynomial x minus a, where a is a complex number. Okay, this is first. The ideal ma is nothing but generated by x minus a. X minus a is the kernel of the substitution homomorphism, first of all. Okay, so the ideal ma is I am denoting the ideal generated by x minus a by ma. Okay, this the ideal ma is the kernel of the substitution homomorphism from the polynomial ring cx to c, which sends f of x to f of a, just a substitution homomorphism. This is the first kernel. We have to prove that it is just obvious, it is a kernel, but we have to prove that it is maximal. Okay, then thus because of these two, you see, given a complex number a, I can construct one x minus a is a linear polynomial. Okay, then I can construct one ideal generated by the linear polynomial x minus a. That by this proposition it produces a maximal ideal ma. Okay, given a maximal ideal, this is equal to ma for some a, and given any complex number a, I can produce ma. Okay, so this means this is a bijective correspondence between the set of all maximal ideals in the polynomial ring cx and the complex numbers a, points in the complex number a. Okay, the points corresponds to maximal ideal in the polynomial ring. Every maximal ideal in the polynomial ring corresponds to a point. Okay, this is the language he wants, this book. Okay, what we have to prove? First, every maximal ideal is, first we have to prove that every maximal ideal is generated by a linear polynomial. We have to prove. Okay, let us do. Let M be a maximal ideal. Since already we know that C is a field, therefore every ideal in C of x is a principal ideal. So let f of x is the least monic polynomial of least degree, such that I have not written is this f of x is generating M. Okay, so M is a given maximal ideal, and there is a least degree polynomial inside M, which is monic, which generates the ideal M. Okay, we want to say this f of x is nothing but linear. Since every complex polynomial has a root in C, this is coming from fundamental theorem of algebra. In other words, C is algebraically closed. So fundamental theorem of algebra says every complex polynomial has a root. So it means f of x has a root. It means f of x is divisible by x minus a for some a in C. The a is nothing but the root of the polynomial given f of x. So that means this f of x lies inside the ideal generated by x minus a, because you see this x minus a divides f of x. Therefore, all the multiples of x minus a, f of x is also inside. Okay, so f of x is nothing but multiple of some polynomial with x minus a. That means m is contained in the ideal generated by x minus a. M is maximal by assumption. So therefore, m has to be equal to this, or m should be equal to, either this equal to this, or that ideal generated by single element, single linear polynomial, that should be equal to c of x. Okay, but this is not equal to c of x. Okay, so you just check why it is true. Okay, then it means that maximal ideal is m is nothing but the ideal generated by single polynomial x minus a, the linear polynomial generated by linear polynomial. Okay. So first condition we have proved. What we have proved, we have taken a arbitrary maximal ideal of c of x. That is nothing but it is a principal ideal generated by a linear polynomial x minus a. Now we want to prove this. Okay, every maximal ideal in c of x will look like this. That's all. But this x minus a is okay. We in order to prove, m is already maximal. Therefore, this okay. What we have done is m is a maximal ideal. Therefore, we connected m by the ideal generated by x minus a for some a. We are taking any given a in the complex number a, and we are looking at the ideal generated by x minus a, and we want to prove this is also maximal. So that this correspondence is a bijective correspondence between set of maximal ideals and set of points in complex numbers. Okay. Okay. So we if we want to prove this is maximal ideal, c of x modulo this quotient, we look at the quotient ring, c of x modulo this ideal generated by x minus a. If we can prove this is a field, then we are done. In fact, this field is isomorphic to C. Okay, this quotient ring is isomorphic to C. Okay, why it is? It is coming from the substitution map. For any given A in C, let the substitution map SA from the polynomial ring C of x to complex number C. SA is a surjective homomorphism because any given A we can get the constant polynomial which is sends to that. Okay. So any given B in the complex, any given B complex number, we can get the same constant polynomial here in Cx, which sends to that. Okay, okay. Therefore, it's a surjective ring homomorphism. Now we look at the kernel set of all f of x inside the polynomial ring such that f of a is a root. A is a root of that f of x. It means x minus a divides f of x. That means this is nothing but generated by single element x minus a, since it is a kernel. Therefore, so what we have seen is, given a maximal ideal m of c of x, which is nothing but generated by single element x minus a, okay, linear polynomial generated by linear polynomial x minus a. Given a linear polynomial x minus a, the ideal generated by that x minus a is maximal. Okay, therefore every maximal ideal in C of x corresponds to point is corresponding to maximal ideal in polynomial ring. Okay. Okay, now you are going to see the first non-trivial theorem in this course, which is going to be Hilbert's Nullstellar sorts. What is this theorem? Kind of what we have seen here is we have studied all the maximal ideals of the polynomial ring C of x. Okay, how it look like, and every every point in C give rise to a maximal ideal in C of X, and it is this correspondence is bijective. Suppose if we, instead of one variable, suppose if we take two variable polynomial ring C of X comma Y, and then can we generalize this same idea? Okay, now the question is to you now, what should be the generalization for two variable? The same theorem, but what should be the generalization for C of X comma Y? I want to study all the maximal ideals in C of X comma Y. Okay, polynomial ring in two variable with complex coefficients. Okay, so what should be the maximal ideal look? How the maximal ideal in the two variable polynomial ring will look like over the complex numbers? Any wild guess? First, you just see this theorem and you try to just generalize this.
So is it ideal generated by X minus a Y minus B?
It's a guess. Yeah,
Yeah.
this is kind of guess. So in terms of, okay, you read this kind of different way. Any maximal ideal in one variable polynomial is corresponding to a point in the complex number. Okay, a point is corresponding to maximal ideal. This is bijective. Similarly, what should be the statement there in two variable? Suppose your guess is correct, I assume. Then
A point in C2.
Point in C2. Every maximal ideal in two variable is corresponding to a point in C2, and a point in C2 should correspond to the maximal ideal in C of X comma Y. Okay, that's the guess. In fact, that is what Hilbert's Nullstellar sorts. Okay. 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 So instead of two general, okay, the maximal ideals of the polynomial ring in n variable over complex numbers are in bijective correspondence with points in Cn. How many variables you take, that much I mean space, okay, product space in complex plane. So every point in Cn corresponds to a maximal ideal in the polynomial ring in n variable. Okay, and every maximal ideal corresponds to the point. That's the right generalization. In fact, a point, when you take a1, a2, an, n coordinates, okay, corresponds to the kernel of the substitution map the same way as before. Okay, so this ma subscript I have written, that is nothing but the kernel of the substitution map. This is this is an ideal generated by linear polynomials, x1 minus the first coordinate, x2 minus the second coordinate, etc., xn minus the nth coordinate. Okay, this is ideal generated by this n elements. Okay, this is the theorem. Every maximal ideal will be looking like ma for some a, and ma is a maximal ideal. Okay, these two we have to prove. This theorem is not going to be simple like the previous one for one variable case. Okay, so we have to kind of prepare some notions. Okay, I'll start with some notions. Okay, C of X is a vector space over C. First of all, we have been seeing just as a ring, etc. It's a vector space. Everybody knows, right? It's a vector space. It's not a finite dimensional vector space. It's an infinite dimensional vector space. In fact, the basis is 1x, x square, etc. All the monomials of this kind is generating this vector space. Okay. Similarly, if you is that first you start with one variable vector space, one variable polynomial ring, then you just take the n variable polynomial. This is also a vector space with respect to the countable basis. What are the bases here? Take any monomial. That monomial, so every monomial should generate That's what finite linear combination of any monomial is called your polynomial, right? So here the point is the index set I1, I2, In is a n tuple. N tuple we are varying, okay? The n tuple where the I1, I2, In are greater than or equal to 0 and integers. Somewhere it can be 0, but negative we should not take, okay, in the monomial. So this is a countable set again, because Z is countable, then countable product of countable set is countable. So therefore, C of the polynomial ring in n variable is a vector space over C with the countable basis, okay, and all the monomials. The basis is nothing but all the monomials. Okay, this is the first one. Second one, just a lemma. Suppose V is a vector space which is spanned by countable subsets of subset. Okay, V1, V2, V3. Countable set means I can enumerate. I can able to enumerate. So that's what I have enumerated: V1, V2, V3, Vn, etc. Okay, this vector space is spanned by this countable subset. Then suppose if I take, suppose L is a given arbitrary linearly independent set of vectors from V. Then this L is either finite or countably infinite. Nothing, these two only can happen. Okay, so this is intuitively also it is true, because any linearly independent set kind of, okay, it is going to be subset of it is kind of I mean, whatever the spanning set can be more, but the point is here it is countable or finite we are talking about. Okay, so how to prove? Let Vn be the span of the first n vectors V1, V2, Vn, and we intersect Vn with L. That you call it Ln. Okay. Okay. Ln is linearly independent. L is linearly independent set. Therefore, Ln is linearly independent set. Okay. Ln is a linearly independent set of finite dimensional vector space Vn. Why? Because spanning set is just finitely many vectors generating Vn. Okay. Hence, Ln is a finite set. L from Ln to L, how do we get? We just take the union n greater than or equal to 1 Ln, that is L. Since each Ln is given any natural number n, Ln is finite. Therefore, this union is going to be either finite or countably infinite. Okay. This is going to come in the proof. That's the reason I am just recalling it beforehand. Okay. Another linearly independent set. You see, so C of X is a polynomial ring we saw, and then we saw one more field attached with C of X is the rational functions. C of this bracket C of X, a rational function in one variable. This is a field of fractions of C of X. Okay, in this field, okay, so since it is a field, okay, C of X is a field over, therefore this is a vector space over C. Okay, so in this field, how many? So there are this. Okay, so we are saying that there is a subset. You look at here, every element will look like a polynomial divided by another polynomial. Where polynomial f of x by g of x. F of x and g of x belongs to C of x, the polynomial ring Cx. Okay, so here we are not taking all, but we are taking what we are taking is a kind of 1 by x minus alpha. Is a rational function which is inside C this rational function in one variable, and alpha I am varying over all the complex numbers. Okay, so each complex number alpha, I take one rational function which is looks like 1 by x minus alpha. Okay, that I am taking the collection, that I call it S. This S is an uncountable set of linearly independent subset of C of X. Okay, first of all, it is uncountable is clear. Why it is uncountable? Hello? This set is uncountable because for two different complex numbers. Yes, hello.
For alpha, we
Yeah,
have
there
to
are
C is
alpha
uncountable.
belongs to C.
there.
C is uncountable. For every C, we will have x minus alpha. 1 by x minus alpha.
Yeah. So for two distinct complex numbers, x minus x, the linear polynomial is distinct. Okay. So therefore this S is uncountable. What we want to prove is this set is a linearly independent subset of the vector space C of x. Suppose some infinite set, if you want to prove something linearly independent, what do you have to prove? Have you ever?
An infinite set is linearly independent if all its finite subsets are linearly independent.
Yes. You take any arbitrary finite set, finite subset of that. If all its finite subset are linearly independent, then we call it infinite. The set is linearly independent. Okay. So we are going to take arbitrary finite subset from this set S, and we say that that is going to be linearly independent. Here, linearly independent over C means what? You see, it's not like numbers. It's all polynomials, rational functions.
Coefficients we take from C, like
Yeah.
AI is AI xi linear combination of AI is xi is equal to
Yeah.
0. Here coefficients we are taking from C.
Yes. Equal to 0 means what?
Equal to
0
0
plus 0.
function.
0 function.
That is what I am asking. You see, what we are taking is a 0 function. If we want to prove it is non-zero, then we have to produce one particular point where when we plug this function, it should not be 0. Okay. Generally, when we take some elements linearly independent, we prove arbitrary. We take first of all arbitrary coefficient elements. Okay, and the linear combination is always non-zero. We prove here everything is a rational functions as a functions. Here we want to prove given C1, C2, C. Okay, suppose I am taking alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha n is the complex number. Okay, n distinct complex number. Then I am taking the elements like 1 by x minus alpha 1, 1 by x minus alpha n. N elements I am taking from this set. And C1, C2, given any non-zero tuple C1, C2, Cn in from complex numbers, okay, then the linear combination should not be a 0 function. Okay, should not be a 0 function. I have to prove. That's the only catch, nothing more. Okay, since C is uncountable, it is clear that S is uncountable subset of C of X. We need to prove, that finite subset of every finite subset of S is linearly independent over C. So we take arbitrarily alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha n, be distinct complex numbers. We need to prove that this is not identically 0. Okay, for any non-zero tuple, this 3 bars means it's not identically as a function, not identically 0. Okay, that's what it means. So since this tuple is non-zero tuple, we without loss of generality we assume that C1 is non-zero. Okay. Now we look at this is going to be very intuitive. This proof is going to be. Anybody could see the proof? I mean, I am not going into argument yet, but still, anybody could see the proof. So, kind of your complex analysis, you think of, you see 1 by x minus alpha, 1 by z minus alpha. You think of 1 by z minus alpha. So this function has a pole at z equal to alpha. It means what? It is if I take very close to, if I take a neighborhood around alpha, I take beta. Beta is not equal to alpha, but beta is in the very small neighborhood of alpha. I plug beta z equal to beta. 1 by beta minus alpha. What this value will be? Can you see what this value will be? It's going to be huge. It's because when beta touches alpha, it is infinity. Okay, very close to alpha, when I take, it is a arbitrary value. It is going to take arbitrary value. Okay, this 1 by x minus alpha is going to take arbitrary value when I take when I plug x equal to beta, where beta is coming from very small neighborhood of alpha. Okay, that's the first observation. When we put beta equal to x and beta not equal to alpha in a neighborhood of alpha, 1 by beta minus alpha is a large value of complex number. Okay, when beta equal to alpha, of course it has got a pole, therefore we don't take beta equal to alpha, but it is just blowing up so much. Okay, it is, the distance is so small, therefore 1 by the distance is going to be huge. This observation is going to be helpful, okay, to prove this. Okay, so since alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha n are distinct complex numbers, let delta equal to minimum of I not equal to j, modulus value of, I am looking at all the distances between alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha n, all arbitrary, and I am taking the minimum of it. Okay, so delta, that is delta. When we take beta, okay, when we take beta not equal to alpha in a neighborhood of alpha 1, here alpha 1, because I know that C1 is non-zero, that is the reason I am taking. With the radius delta by 100 times max of that modulus CA. Okay, when we choose so small, okay, this C1 by beta minus alpha 1, that modulus value is going to be very large compared to the rest of the linear terms, because the rest of the linear terms, when I plug x equal to beta, okay, beta minus alpha 2, beta minus alpha 3, these are all constant value, just given constant value. Okay, so I have chosen in such a way that this beta is little far away from other alpha is than just alpha 1. Okay, that's why this kind of delta radius I'm choosing. Okay, so this means that, you see, one first term is huge, then rest of the terms is a kind of finite complex number, therefore it never can cancel each other when I put x equal to beta. Okay, this is very intuitive proof. Okay, what we have to say, this function, I mean this function is not a zero function, therefore I have to find a point beta, okay, such that when I plug x equal to beta, I should get non-zero. That's what I'm trying to cook up one beta, how we can do that. Okay, very intuitive. So since it is a 1 by, therefore when I go close to that alpha 1, some beta if I choose, then it blows up. Okay, that's the catch. Therefore these are all linearly independent, which we have done it for. We have taken arbitrary distinct n complex numbers, and we look at arbitrary linear combination of these rational functions, and we said that this is non-zero function. Okay, therefore, which says that 1 by alpha x minus alpha 1, etc., 1 by x minus alpha n are linearly independent over C. Okay, so what we have seen inside C of x, we have uncountably many linearly independent. I mean, inside C of x, we have an uncountable set of linearly independent subset. Okay, set of linearly independent elements. That's it. This is the catch. Okay, this information is required for us. Okay, this is a very intuitive proof, mathematically also correct. Okay, just this is okay. F of x is a polynomial in one variable, a n x power n plus etc. a naught, and a is a given complex number. We plug, we put x equal to u plus a. F of therefore f of u plus a is same as when we put the x equal to u plus a. What we get is first. What we get is f of a first term, Okay, when we, you see, an, a power n, a1, a plus a naught, that put together f of a will come. Plus rest of the u terms without constant terms. Okay, u terms will come. Okay, now we put back, when we put u equal to x minus a, what we get is, we can write f of x as f of a plus some complex coefficient c n x minus a whole power n plus etc. c1 x minus a, where ci's are. So what we are doing f of x is kind of written in terms of x power i's. Okay, x power i's, the monomial x power i's. Now we are changing the monomial into x minus a and its powers, linear combination. That's all we are just doing. Okay, it is like a Taylor expansion for a differentiable function around the neighborhood a. Okay, the same thing is true when we take, this is nothing to do, nothing special with respect to only one variable. Even in two variable, if you take f of x1, x2 inside the polynomial ring, then a is a given point in C2, a1, a2. Okay, coordinates, first coordinate and second coordinate. Then when we can able to write f of x1, x2 same way, just to plug x1 equal to u1 plus a1 and x2 equal to u2 plus a2, where u equal to u1 comma u2. Okay, so then when you do that, same way you can get. First term is f of the evaluated at the point, given point a1, a2. Okay, f evaluated at a given point a1, a2, and rest of the terms, if you see, x1 minus a1, x2 minus a2, all the combination and powers etc. will be there, linear combination. Okay, same way here, how the one variable came, the same way is two variable and n variable. Okay, the main point is that when we first term, the constant term is going to be the evaluation map, that evaluation, evaluating f at the given point a1, a2, a. Okay, this is clear. So this is general. Okay, so up to this, you have any doubt? Because we are going to get into the proof of Hilbert, Nullstellan, and Sartz. Okay, Hilbert, Nullstellan, and Sartz. Anybody knows what is this complete weird name? People must be knowing already. Anyone knows?
Of the zeros.
What is that? Theorem? No.
Of the zeros, something of the zero.
Okay, no. Hilbert's first zeroth lemma. Sartz means lemma. Nullstellan means zeroth lemma. Okay, so Hilbert wrote a monograph. Their first theorem is this only. I mean, first he was writing. That's why he was putting numbers. Hilbert 90. Another one in algebra it comes. This is zero. Hilbert zero theorem. Okay. Okay. So what we are trying to understand is set of maximal ideals inside the n variable polynomial ring over complex numbers. Okay, this set of maximal ideals are going to be in bijective correspondence with given any point in C power n. Okay, that's the way. Okay, we start the proof, and again we have to come back next class. Okay. So first, what all we have to prove? First, given a point, I have to prove, okay, the substitute. Given a point means I can think of the substitution homomorphism from the polynomial ring to C, and I look at the kernel. The kernel is generated by that particular form, and the kernel is clearly, kernel is clearly maximal ideal. Why? Because this quotient is going to be isomorphic to C. Okay, by the earlier. This is clearly MA, the kernel is nothing but MA, that is going to be maximal ideal. What we have to prove is this MA is nothing but generated by this linear polynomials. That's what first we have to prove. First one. Second one is any maximal ideal suppose if you want to prove something bijective correspondence with any maximal ideal is a point. We have taken point to maximal ideal, we have come. Maximal ideal to point we want to come. We take any maximal ideal that, suppose you call it M in the polynomial ring in n variable, that maximal ideal will look like MA for some point A in Cn. Okay, these two we have to prove. First one is, given a point, we construct MA, which is generated by linear polynomials x1 minus a1, etc., xn minus an. Similarly, given a maximal ideal, we construct a point A such that this M is nothing but MA, look like MA. Okay, so I will not get into the proof because this is again I have to come back. Okay, this is a little long. This is the first non-trivial theorem you are at least we are encountering in this course. Yes, sir. I am done today. You can ask question.
It's okay, sir. Any questions?
You read it once more, then you will have a better idea of polynomial rings and stuff. Okay, this is a very nicely written, this particular chapter at least, ring theory. It's a different point of view, but leading towards geometry. But this is a nice approach, giving all the explanation.